Hey folks, welcome back to Ken Michaels Radio. Thanks to all of you who have been so great watching these videos and subscribing to the channel. And as you know, we have a lot of Beatle talk here on the channel. I have lots of great guests that I welcome on. And those of you who have followed my career and the different shows that I've done, this next guest should be no stranger to you. He was a guest on my syndicated radio show, Every Little Thing, where he debated between which is a better album from George Harrison, All Things Must Pass, or Cloud Nine. That was a fun show and a fun conversation. And he was on two of the podcast shows for Things We Said Today. And he's also on my website with an interview. So he's kind of everywhere. But John Montagna is our special guest. He's a bass player. He spent, I think it's 7 years with the Alan Parsons Project. He'll have to correct me. Oh, I'm right. Okay, very good.
That is correct.
And
I'm sorry, I wasn't supposed to speak until you introduced me. I apologize.
that's okay. Also, he was in the backup band for the Happy Together tour. I guess that'll resume once the pandemic's over, and maybe he'll be involved with that. We'll find out. He doesn't know.
I won't be involved in it. I don't know if it's going to resume.
Okay. Well,
Well, it's because of, you know what? I'm just going to wait until you introduce me to say anything.
that's okay. Let's see. Also, he was part of something called a Walk Down Abbey Road back in the early 2000s, and that was really a great concept where a lot of various superstars got together and formed one band. Alan Parsons was in that. Todd Rundgren was in it as well, and a whole bunch of other great people. Christopher Cross, for example, Ann Wilson. And they did their own hits for the first set, and then the second set was all Beatles songs. And John was in the backup band for that in one of the tours. And those of you who go to the Fest for Beatle fans know that John has done some really great clinics on bass playing, studying Paul's bass work in the Beatles, talking about that and his solo career. He's done tremendous work. He's got great videos also you can watch on YouTube. And let's welcome John Montagna to the show.
It's a pleasure.
Okay.
Always a pleasure, Ken.
So before we start about talking about Paul as a bass player, you are involved with this brand new tribute to Ram called Ram On. And here on the
That's
channel, we
right.
just interviewed Denny Sywell and
Yeah.
Fernando Perdomo
Yeah, yeah.
talking about it. So why don't you talk about how you became involved with this project?
Yes, would love to. It was very kind of sudden. I've known Fernando for a number of years. Um, I want to say we first met when I was still with Alan Parsons. I think he was at, if I'm remembering this correctly, I think he was at one of the shows that we did in Florida,
Hmm.
and we struck up a friendship as you do with like fellow, Beatle people.
Hmm.
And he's also a big power pop guy. In fact, Fernando was involved in the resurgence of the late great Emmett Rhodes.
Wow.
He was involved in that. I'm not. I'm not sure if he produced that
No, Chris
project or if he
Price.
just played guitar in it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. But he was involved. He was involved with Emmett. There was a team of people that was helping Emmett kind of get his songs together for that. So we bonded on that level.
Uh-huh.
And so we kept in touch online over the years. And one night I'm sitting here in my what has become my sort of portal to the outside world, in the pandemic, and I get a Facebook message from Fernando. Hey, bro, happening in my studio right now. And I'm like, ooh, what's that? And he sends me a video clip of Denny Sywell cutting drum tracks. And he's got headphones on, so I couldn't hear the song. It's just right away I knew it was Sywell, just
Uh-huh.
jamming away on the kit. And I'd met Denny at one of the fests a couple of years ago. We were introduced by some mutual friends, and he was really, really cool. And The first lineup of Wings, I mean, all of the Wings lineups have their own sort of character,
Mm-hmm. Sure
but
do.
I've always had I've had a very special sort of affinity for that first lineup, the University Tour lineup. And I know I can sort of drop very sort of deep Beatles nerd references, and people will know what I'm talking about when I say the University Tour lineup,
Mm-hmm.
right? I can, so that's because we're among
Yeah.
the Beatle people. Okay, so I've just always really dug that lineup specifically. They were just a little bit more raw and funky, and part of that might have been because it was the first, and Paul was just like really, he just really just kind of broke everything down to the studs and started over again,
Mm-hmm.
fresh, and it was uh, real bare bones. If you look at the songs, I mean, real bluesy, raw rock and roll kind of vibe.
Sure.
But I also realized that Sywell's background as a jazz drummer
Mm-hmm.
and as a studio drummer and as a very successful studio drummer. I got to talk to him after we did the project, and he was kind of filling me in on like the studio scene when he was involved back in the 70s in New York, and his background playing jazz and playing Brazilian music. And I really think that something very special happened in that rhythm section between Paul and Denny,
Mm-hmm.
as their relationship as a drummer and bass player together. So I was just thrilled, like, hey, you're recording Simon. How cool is that, man? Great. So Fernando messaged me. We're re-recording the Ram album for the 50th anniversary. Know any bass players? And I was like, oh my god! So I have immediately to my right at all times is my Rickenbacker 4001,
Mm-hmm.
and I basically I just responded with just a photo of this bass and my audio interface, and I'm like ready to go. You say the word, man, and
Hmm.
I absolutely want a piece of this action. So long story short, I got to play on Smile Away and Another Day. I think we were working it out. He's like, Another Day is up for grabs. And I was like, yes, give me that. Because that's a great bass line. And
Oh,
it's
I
just
know.
a masterclass in just vintage McCartney bass line that supports. I talk about this in the clinic. It does everything that a bass line is supposed to do, where it supports the rhythm, it supports the chord changes, it outlines the harmony,
Hmm.
but it's creative and melodic on its own. It's like a counter melody that exists on its own. I mean, it's functional and it's interesting by itself, and it never steps on the vocal. It never gets in the way.
Hmm.
It's just perfect, and he's a master at that. So, then I found out that Sywell had arranged for David Spinoza, the great New York
Sure.
City session guitarist,
Yeah.
legendary guitarist, to reprise his guitar lines on this song.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh, now I'm not only paying tribute to McCartney, I'm stepping into like New York City like session royalty.
Uh-huh.
I'm gonna be on a track with Denny Sywell and Dave Spinoza together, even if it's just virtual.
Right.
I said this is I'm like beyond psyched for this thing. So, I figured let me knock out Smile Away first. It's a shuffle,
Mm-hmm.
3 chords, fuzz bass. That ought to be easy. And let me get myself plugged in here. And can you hear that?
Yeah. That's good.
Okay,
Maybe a little
there
louder.
we go. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I figured I'll knock this out. I'll knock this out in one take, put the fuzz bass on, good to go. And so Fernando sent me a mix of drums, guitar, vocals, with no bass, and how we do these remote sessions. It's zeroed out at the top of the session. You do your track to that, and then send it, and it starts at the same point, so it's lined up, and he can just drop it in. So I crank the track, and I'm standing up, eyes closed, and I'm like, yeah, ram, yeah, and I'm like picturing all those black and white photos of like Denny and Paul in the studio together.
Yeah.
I'm like imagining myself there. I'm like, yeah, 1971, New York City, right? I listen back to the first take, and it's horrible. I'm like all over the place, sloppy, and it's just terrible. So it was humbling because I thought like, well, I've known this album my whole life. I've known this music my whole life. It's going to be like this. And it was a huge lesson in like not taking familiar material for granted. You know what I mean? So I figured, okay, I got one horrendous like fanboy take out of my system. Now let me do the work. And with remote rhythm section tracking, normally if Denny and I were in the studio together, we'd be listening to each other, and I would be adjusting my phrasing to match his, and vice versa. And it's that sort of give and take. I mean, 2, 3, 4, like that downbeat. There's an infinite number of points where you can hit that beat, and like where you hit it in relation to where everyone else is hitting it. That's why it feels so good, when a band like the Stones comes in together or something like that, or why it feels so lousy when a band doesn't come in together, right? So with remote tracking, there's none of that. I have to adjust to a pre-existing track, right? Because they're not going to listen to me. I have to find the spaces in something that already exists. And it's Denny Sywell on drums, Davey Johnstone on guitar, somebody else on guitar whose name I'm blanking on, and I apologize. But it's a great. I mean, they really, Fernando as well. I think is it Joey Sykes who plays guitar on that? Oh,
Okay.
I'm sorry.
I don't have the credits with me. So.
Yeah. And so, but in any case, and I also spotted right away that this was not like a straight note for note, like sound-alike re-record. It was, evoke the spirit of the album that we all love, but definitely bring the presence of the present day.
Right.
You know what I mean? Which, has always kind of been my kind of stock and trade, working with what they politely call legacy artists. I love how they came up, when in the 70s, acts from the 50s were called oldies acts.
Right.
It's an oldies act, right? Now they're called legacy artists. That's my inner George
Much better
Carlin
sounding.
Much better sound, exactly. But you are walking that fine line between like authenticity, evoking the feeling of that music that people already know. People, Mark Volman from the Turtles told me that. He says, we are out there activating sense memories, right? So, yes, play the music authentically, but note for note for note, like you're just transcribing the records. There's something that gets lost if you don't also inject your own personality.
Right.
And you still have to be a tight rhythm section. So it took maybe 2 or 3 more takes of me like really concentrating on where they placed the beat, and then I would, so if we're getting to the end of like a turnaround right before the next verse, like right before it gets to that part, if Denny goes and then to the next downbeat, if I go, it's gonna fall apart. So if I need to, or something, which is something else I learned from McCartney as a bass player. He was a master at utilizing sustain, note length, I teach a Beatles 101 class on Zoom for Gowanus Music Club, and we were talking about we were just working on Day Tripper,
Mm-hmm.
and how the bridge is right,
Mm-hmm.
right, and so when it starts to build, those short, he keeps those notes short,
Yeah.
but if he had gone, or
Mm.
there's so many different ways you can do it, but he's and placing them just at the right spot, like along with Ringo,
Mm-hmm.
and it just creates this feeling. He's taking advantage of the fact that he's got an instrument that's not just supporting the harmony but the rhythm as well. He kind of
Mm-hmm.
becomes a part of the drum kit almost. So he was a master at that as well. So, stuff like that. So I would go in and like, oh, that fill, let me add something under there to kind of emphasize that, you know. So 2-3 takes and Smile Away was done. And
Right.
then it was time to tackle Another Day, and I thought, I'm not going to get burned twice. I'm not just going to assume that because I've known this song literally my entire life that I can, nail this thing. So I'll hold this up for you viewers. This is my chart that I made, just kind of notating certain specific. I mean, obviously,
Mm.
there's certain things in there that you have to catch.
Right.
Like. You have to play that, right? But where you place, or like how to phrase it so that the whole thing sounds good, that's the sort of intricate stuff that I had to kind of pay attention to. And also, Denny didn't play the same drum part that's on the record. The record starts out, the original, every day she takes some learning that she likes on her. There's just like hits on the downbeat, right?
Mm-hmm.
Our version, which you'll hear on the CD called Ramon, that'll be available in sometime in May.
May 14th.
May 14th, wherever you buy your music. I had to get a plug in there. He starts in the groove right away. Every day she takes some morning that she likes on her. So right away, I'm like, oh, this isn't a straight, like before. It's not a straight sound-alike. This is, pay attention to what's going on now, kind of thing.
It's really the album is a faithful. They're faithful renditions to
Yes.
the original, with a certain amount of freedom given to it. Really,
Yeah.
and I love the balance of the two, because there are times when it's nailed, almost exactly what's on the album. So, and I was talking to Fernando about that, and it's amazing.
Yeah. And that's, you know what? My hat is off to him, to Danny and to Fernando as well, because that is a very difficult line to walk when you're dealing with, for lack of a better term, catalog material, music that people know for, besides guys like you and me who are total geeks on this stuff, that know like every note and where everything is phrased. You want to be faithful, but you also don't want to just do a sound alike and have people go, well, why am I listening to this? I could just listen to the original. But there is definitely a feeling that the tracks that I've heard, there really is, you can tell how much everyone that's involved in this project loves this album. And everybody brought their A game to this thing. And my hat is off to Fernando for walking that line and making something that evokes the spirit of the original, but also is rooted in the present day. That is a tricky thing to do.
It kind of reminds me when I spoke to Brian Ray a few years ago, how you handle the Beatles songs live with Paul.
Oh my
You
God, I can't
know, should
imagine.
you be exactly faithful and play the exact same parts that are on the Beatles record? And he was saying, well, there's some of that, but you also have to put some of your own style in there, your own stamp. So
Yeah.
it's a combination of both.
I can tell you from experience, my first encounter with this stuff was with Alan Parsons, and those records, the Alan Parsons Project records, are, I mean, orchestrated. I mean, those things are, those arrangements are like, they're like meticulously designed
Mm,
to work a certain way. Like every part has to be right, or the thing just falls apart. And
right.
so, myself, Godfrey Townsend on guitar, Steve Murphy on drums, Manny Focarazzo on keys. The four of us came together to do that gig and to learn we had to learn those parts and learn those songs quickly.
Mm,
And I really think that experience made us such a tight unit.
mm,
And when we started doing, like you say, these Walk Down Abbey Road shows and Happy Together, we were able to just catch anything you threw at us. Like, okay, this year's lineup, we've got Gary Lewis from Gary Lewis and the Playboys, Chuck Negron from Three Dog Night,
mm.
and Mitch Ryder. And we, in one show, we have to sound like the Detroit Wheels, Three Dog Night, and the Playboys, like all at once. And it was like, yep, got it, right? And but what happened with Parsons was interesting. Is that, like, we learned the songs, we did our first couple of shows. All right, sounds good, guys, everybody. After about a year or two on the road, playing those songs night after night, the arrangements started to evolve, and they began to take on the character of, like, us as a band, right? Which,
Interesting. Yeah.
yeah, and groups tend to form personalities of their own just by being together in close quarters all the time, being on stage all the time. So, and just being on, in front of 5,000 people. Quote the Raven, nevermore. I mean, you're gonna hit that a little bit harder when there's like 5,000, you know, wherever you are in the world, shouting for you. And a couple of years in, at one point, we went and listened to some of the original records, and we were like, oh my God, it sounds nothing like that now.
Hmm.
Everything had gotten a few beats faster, and just it had gotten a little bit harder edged. But that just because it just evolved over time, just because you're playing it in front of people,
Right.
and like that. But again, so my hat is off to Fernando for doing a great job with that. But yeah, so another day, followed my chart, caught the things, and then that was that. And I'm thrilled to be a part of this thing. Sorry to go off on a whole tangent
That's
about that, but
okay.
that's.
Not everybody recognizes another day for having a great bass line.
Mm-hmm.
But in particular, when Paul's doing, sorry, the do 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 do, there's some real fast
Mm-hmm.
runs he does on the
Yeah.
bass that are really interesting.
I mean, to
Yeah.
throw in that syncopation. I mean, that's a really bold
Hmm.
choice. But I mean, in the verses, "Sleeping in the stocking, sleeping in the gym," I mean, he's laying back, but it's a new section, and to add all that syncopation in there changes the rhythm up. And this is his genius as a bass player. He thinks like a composer. I mean, he's a fine bassist already. And I say this in my clinic, if all he ever did, never mind the songwriting and singing and just being the sort of like figurehead that he is, if all he ever was like the bass player from the Beatles, if that's all he ever did, his legacy would be secure. You know what I mean? Like his achievements on, for our instrument are like enough. You know what I mean? But just the level of creativity that he brought to this instrument at a time when there was not a real sort of established vocabulary yet. The bass guitar was only invented in 1951. That was Leo Fender was the first guy to successfully amplify the EADG of an upright bass. So there was no sort of established vocabulary for this instrument yet, and so the first couple of guys, there's James Jamerson, Carol Kay, people like that, and even going back before the Monk Montgomery. I'm forgetting the name of the gentleman who was in Lionel Hampton's band. Leo Fender brought one of the first prototypes to Lionel Hampton, and he was like, "This is great. It weighs about a fraction of the double bass, cuts our cartridge bill in half." And the guy was initially reluctant to play it, but he's like, "Hey, I can play sitting down. I can hear myself. This is brilliant." Right? So McCartney, switched to the instrument at a time when there was no one really to copy. I mean, a lot of the lines that he was learning were played on double bass with Willie Dixon, all those Joe Maudlin with Buddy Holly and the Crickets, or Bill Black with Elvis.
Yeah.
So he brought his skill set as a songwriter, as a composer, and just his natural affinity for arrangements, what fits, what doesn't fit, into constructing these lines. And we talk about the stuff he did with the Beatles, but his solo work on bass is interesting because his job description in Wings was different. I think we talked about this on Things We Said Today last time I was on.
We did.
I forget who asked me, one of the other guests asked me the question, like, how come the bass lines with Wings weren't as interesting or something, words to that effect. And I was like, now wait just a second. When you're the band leader and you're the front man and you're the tour manager and you're managing the payroll and the buses and all that stuff, when you get on stage, all you want to do is go, "People gather here tonight." You just want to dig into it. But that's just as cool too. It's just as hard to. I mean, if that's your job for the right, and nobody could lay into eighth notes like he can. You know what I mean? That was just my inspiration. Like, whenever I'm on a gig and I'm like playing the bass and singing, like early on, like I kind of developed those two sides of my brain to operate together.
What's interesting, just bouncing off what you just said.
Yeah.
Very often it's been brought up, why is Paul's bass playing more interesting and more imaginative when it's for a John song or a George song? And Paul answered that question because he said, all I had to concentrate on was the bass.
That's right.
When it comes to his own songs, you got to think of everything, the entire arrangement, what the different instruments are going to do. So, yeah, that's kind of interesting. That
is interesting. Yeah, and it's not. But the thing is, he can't help his creativity. A friend of mine used to say that he used to use the phrase when you're stuck being yourself, right? So if he's playing bass on a John song or on a George song, he's not gonna just sit there and like do the bare minimum of what's necessary. Like, he's gonna think of a part that works, and his ability to conceive of parts that are absolutely perfect from an arrangement standpoint. I mean, there's very few guys like that. He's just, I don't think he's ever been like content to just like play the root of the chord on the downbeat. He brings his melodic sense to everything, and you hear that coming out primarily on John and George songs. So that's why the solo stuff is so interesting, because he is, like you say, he's the writer and he's the singer and he's the producer, but he's also still thinking in terms of what's going to work arrangement wise. And being a band leader who's a bass player is also a very happy accident. You've got so much control. Here we go, guys. I can do things to, I can change my phrasing up as a way to sort of control the pulse and get people's attention. You know what I mean? And being a band leader who is a singing bass player, you know, most of my guys with McCartney, Entwistle, Jack Bruce, Sting, are bass players who also sing. And being at the top of the music and the bottom at the same time is, you have a lot of control. You know what I mean? So I you know, it's his solo bass lines are, you know, it's just it's a different kind of field of study besides the Beatles stuff. There's how do you define creativity? You know what I mean? I mean, this doesn't sound like an interesting bass line, but it's exactly what's needed.
Right.
Right.
And
but
he had the feel for that.
He had the feel for that, and that record rocks.
Yes.
You put on Junior's Farm today, and it's like, you know, and you know, so every rhythm section had its own flavor. Every drummer that he matched up with, you know, he had a specific sort of relationship. You know, I wrote some notes down about a couple of solo bass lines that I wanted to get to sort of point out. Just a few little flourishes of things. Where there's a track on Pipes of Peace, Average Person.
Sure.
You know.
Yep.
You know. I mean, it's just hanging on an A chord before where it goes back to the C. So that little, I mean, it's just, that always kind of jumped out at me. There's like a little space in the vocal phrase. Also from Pipes of Peace, So Bad. Something like that.
Yeah.
It means so much to me. That little girl, I love you. I mean, that's like, from an orchestrator's perspective, that's brilliant, because that sets up girl, I love you. You know, it's tension and release and dynamics, all the things that orchestrators think of. I say this in the clinic about how studying his bass lines gives you what I call the macro view. Like, it's one thing to learn the melody of a song. If you're learning a Beatles song, you learn the melody, you learn the chord changes, and you're good. Once you learn the bass line, suddenly there's like a whole other dimension to the music, and maintaining an awareness of that allows you to hear the whole picture, which is going to help your overall musicianship. So a lick like this, so bad.
Yeah.
I mean, that's cool. That's wonderful. It's beautiful, but
That's so much a part of the song to me.
It's exactly. It becomes an additional hook for the song, which is something James Jamerson was brilliant at. Joe Osborne, the aforementioned Carol Kay.
Yeah.
They would do things that were, everything they did was supportive, but when there was a space to kind of throw something in there, if you're gonna, it's, you know, it's when you're in a conversation at a party, you know, and there's a lull, and you want to, you say something that you think is going to be clever. You want it to matter.
Right.
You know what I mean? You don't want to just jump in with something that makes everybody go, what? You want to say something that like livens up the conversation, right? So,
isn't it kind of like if you're a drummer and like with doing fills in the
absolutely,
right spot?
Absolutely,
like
it applies for any instrument.
Yeah.
It applies for any instrument, and knowing that if somebody else is doing something, you
Back away.
step out of the way. I mean, it's like, you know, the use of space is something that we never talk about. But coming up, you know, perfect,
Right.
perfect. That's exactly what that song needs. Anything else, that song wouldn't. I mean, you know, you put that record on today, and you're like, oh yeah, right. Anything else, if he did
That'd
extra
be too
stuff, it would
busy.
just exactly.
Yeah.
But just knowing exactly what it is at any time. Old Siam, sir. I used to love when he would on the bridge. You just sliding up to that high octave, stuff stuff like that. It's perfect. What's another one? Oh, name that tune, Ken.
Uh-oh.
Oh, come on. Well, all right. So I'll give you the downbeat. The bass line doesn't start on one. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4.
I should know this.
Take it away.
Oh, okay.
Wanna hear you play. Yeah.
Sorry.
No,
Now, when you added
that's
the
okay.
extra notes there, I recognized it, but without you
All right.
singing.
But that's another one where he throws in this lick at the end of the phrase. Wait at the bar, by a dark and corner scene. Right? There's a little space in there before the next vocal line. Just throws in a little thing, and it just jumps out at you a little bit. It's like, and it's from an arrangement perspective, it's brilliant.
Do you
Doesn't
think,
get in the way, you know.
with
I'm
all
sorry.
the experience that Paul has had, certainly in the Beatles, with doing different harmonies, working out different parts, you were mentioning counter melody before. He has it in his brain, and so
Yes,
he's applying that to the bass lines,
that's right.
whether they're full melodies or whether they're licks like you're coming up with.
That's
You
right.
know, I guess that was, perfect training. Your mind is working on whole different melodic lines, especially if you're doing harmonies.
That's right. That's right. And I think their situation, the Beatles' situation, the way they came to be who they became, is that they were learning this stuff as they were doing it in the studio.
Hmm.
I mean, one of the things in Beatles 101, when myself and Jack Petrozelli from the Fat Foe is in
Right.
this thing with me, along with Cameron Greider, monster guitar player, and Josh Margolis from Gowanus Music Club. The four of us take these songs and we break them apart and we get into all the historical information,
Hmm.
and we are consistently just blown away at, like, not only how intricate some of these parts are and how interesting they are on their own, but then we start getting into the history that, like, this song was cut in, like, they did 12 takes and it was done like in a day. They didn't obsess over the stuff for like weeks and weeks and weeks. Like, as I'm sure many of your listeners are aware, I've just seen a phase. Yesterday and I'm Down were recorded in the same session,
Right.
like in one day, right? So they were not just Paul, all of them were learning these things and applying their gifts into these musical situations, like right in front of us, and it was going right on record as they were discovering this stuff. Well, what else can we do? What else can we try here? Let's make this. Oh, that sounds good. Let's bring that in. All that sense of discovery, and it was going down right away as they were sort of catching this stuff. That's why we're still talking about them, 5 decades later. That's why you're not doing a YouTube channel devoted to the Dave Clark 5. As
Can
great
you?
as they are, I'm just saying.
I was wondering if you can explain. Like, I bought this book many years ago. I do have a musical background. I know I don't talk about
Okay.
it all that much.
All right.
I do play basic piano and guitar
Nice.
and some bass,
All right.
mainly the trumpet.
Okay.
But I would look at this so I can play the bass along to what was here in the transcriptions. And I've heard not all of it's accurate. But can you hear in your own ears? Um, there's different ways of playing the same note. You can play the same note on a different string, higher up on the fret,
Mm-hmm.
and what a
That's right.
difference that could have made in the way that you're hearing what Paul's playing when it's played.
Absolutely.
What difference is there? To
Well, I mean, it's funny. I was just talking to one of my students recently. We were working out how he was gonna, which fingering he was gonna use for something. So, if I play the A on the second fret of the G string versus the A on the seventh fret of the D string, it's a subtle difference sonically, as you can hear. Now I'm going to play the same A on the 12th fret of the A string.
Hmm.
Right? Now I'm going to play that same A on a higher fret on the E string. Each time, would you agree that this string is shorter and thicker? Sorry about the fret buzz. Than this one?
Oh yeah.
Right. So all of that is going to affect here as opposed to there. So I don't know what was going on in Paul's mind while he was cutting those tracks.
Mm-hmm.
Like a bass line like that would be something. That would be something, really would be something. Like every time
Yeah.
he does that lick, I don't know if he does it here or here. Because, again, the bass that we're hearing on that record is, I don't know how old those strings are. It's through an amp with a mic in front of it. That mic is going through a mixing board and probably a compressor and an EQ and a this and a that. Then that goes to tape, which saturates the signal. And then that tape goes through another board and another this and another that to another tape, which then goes through something else, which goes to vinyl, which comes out of our parents' record player. So who knows how he, which fingering he decided to use. It's what he used is fingering wise is irrelevant. If I'm in a situation, if I'm on a gig with our mutual friend Ed Ryan, and we're doing That Would Be Something
Yeah.
with me and him and a drummer, it's up to me to either go there or, what works in relation to Ed's guitar and whoever the drummer is, what room we're in, right? So I'm very careful about getting too into the minutia of like which strings did he use, what pickup was he using, even on a Rick.
Right.
Right now this is the neck pickup. If I go to the bridge pickup, right, he very well could have had the bridge pickup on, but because his strings might have been old and the bass is mic'd and that's his settings on the amp or whatever, for me, I just want this thing to not, I just want that lick to jump out just enough for people to go, oh yeah, the bass lick from That Would Be Something, right? And have it sit in the pocket as well. I still have to phrase it so that it matches rhythmically. I still have my first responsibility is to my bandmates on the bandstand and to lock in with them. And when guys say, "Oh, that's not the part on the record," I'm like, "Well, you know what? Nobody else on the gig is playing the parts on the record. So if you're the only guy like playing the part from the scores book, and everybody else is just kind of like doing the song from memory, then we're not locking in as a band." You know what I mean? I was reading Harpo Marx's autobiography, and late in life they sent him to Russia to do shows in Russia. Just Harpo, and
Yeah.
basically the deal was they would write these sort of like goofy, like plays of the very straight laced sort of people, and then just drop Harpo into them. And he's like, I didn't speak Russian, they didn't speak English, but so I would just basically go around and there'd be these people talking, and then I would like run in and knock things over and all that kind of stuff. So and the actors like didn't know what was going on half the time, right?
Yeah.
So you don't want to approach music like that. Learn what was happening on the records, understand the intention of it, but pay attention to what's going on around you in the present day, and do something that works. Because if I do the bass line off the record, but the drummer's never heard the song before,
Mm.
and I just have to, which I've done many times, is like, oh, I don't know this song, just watch me, and I'm like, I'll be okay. Now there's going to be a stop. Here we go, and then we back
Right.
in, directing traffic, we call that. I remember one time doing it Don't Come Easy on stage,
Yeah.
and Steve Murphy was the drummer, and he didn't know the song, and I'm like, don't worry about it, I got you. So, and
How can you
I
not
was
know the
giving
song?
well,
Okay.
Murphy was listening to to Zeppelin.
Okay.
The guy can do, I don't, it just did, he recognized it, but like Murphy likes to do things right. He doesn't like to just blag his way through something
Right.
like a bar band does.
Yeah.
So I'm like shouting drum fills at him like a bar in advance. Blah, blah, da, 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 da. Phil too, and I just like kind of like directed him through it, and he nailed it.
Uh-huh.
Because he knows, once I told him it's a Ringo song,
Mm.
he kind of knows the feeling to go for, and I tell him, do a fill that sounds like Ringo here. He knows what that means.
Mm.
You know what I mean? But yeah, so it's a constant balance of like knowing the stuff, but also you're sort of understanding the intention behind it and the feeling behind it, and everybody's hopefully doing that together, so that what comes out is a mixture of like, hey, this great song that we all remember, but we're still in the present day. You know what I
Mhm.
mean?
Was there a moment, just going back to the Beatle days,
Yeah.
when you noticed this tremendous leap by Paul as a bass player? Because there's so many songs you could cite as being so brilliant, but like even now to this day, you always learn something new, even later on, hearing the same records that you've heard for
Yes.
50 years. And I'm noticing what a great bass line there was in The Word, which I never gave enough credit to.
Yep.
But
Yep.
it's so.
You know what? I will tell you this: every single one of these things that we do for Beatles 101, if I could just find one, um, like I said, I take these things for granted. I've known these songs my whole life,
Yeah.
and we work out the songs we're gonna do, because it's an online class, right? So what we got around the thing of not being able to be in person. We said, well, we'll make GarageBand sessions for people with the individual tracks. They can learn the parts,
Hmm.
and then they can jam along, record their own parts, that kind of thing. And then we do breakout rooms where we do stuff together. And so Cameron will send me the drum track and the guitar track and a vocal, let's say, for me to do a bass line to. And I'm like, okay. And I'm like, Day Tripper. Okay, yeah, how long would it take me to knock out the bass line of Day Tripper? Been playing this song since I was 12, no problem. And then I go back and listen, and I'm like, oh, there's that I got to catch. Because we do them authentically. And we also do music -1 videos. So I'm also being filmed. So there's that pressure too.
Yeah.
And I want to start releasing the outtakes, like the close up of my hands, and then when I mess up, going, God damn it! I want to start posting that. See, there you go. Right, fingering that. And then the choruses. The first chorus. But then the second chorus, right? He changes up just enough, right?
Yeah.
Little tiny details like that. You break these things apart. See, I'll show you my little cheat sheet for Day Tripper that I made, working on that bass line. You know, the difference between to find out, and I found out, as opposed to find out, and I found out. You know, all those little kind of details. Again, I'm not in his brain. I don't know what was going through his mind. Was he thinking about this stuff consciously, or was he just responding, you know, to Ringo and John and George on guitar, and you know, feeling, you know, stuff that works. I'll tell you one bass line that like really knocked me out was "All I've Got to Do." Whenever double stops, right? There's a lot of stuff in here. I mean, this is like this again. Studying these bass lines, it's like a master class in like how to construct a bass line. And the same goes for me. Where are we here? Let's see. Whenever you want me, it's on. I'll be here, yes. Just gotta call on me. Gotta call on me. You know, again, staccato, cutting off short like that.
Were there other bass players doing that at the time? Or was that more of a session musician kind of thing, or what?
Well, that is the science of being a session musician is playing the thing once, like the first time, and doing everything perfectly right. I mean, as we know, the Beatles were doing, you know, they would do 27 takes of something, right? The skill of a session player is like get the chart and go, here we go, okay, 2, 3, 4, or whatever it is, right away playing it and making it sound as if you've been rehearsing this thing for 6 weeks. That's the genius of session players, coming up with parts like on the spot that work. You know, Ron Carter was just talking about that, about the session scene in New York in the 70s. There's no rehearsals, and everything was done live. So one guy screws up and it's like, really, dude? And then because time is money.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
We've got 3 hours to get these 6 songs in the can. You know, Sinatra famously would do 1, maybe 2 takes of something, and that's, you're talking about a 36-piece, you know, big band, orchestra, conductor, all this, you know, and you got to nail it immediately. So as that was the paradigm shift of rock and roll. It's 4 guys in a room, you know, and you know, taking 27 takes, choosing the best one,
Right.
you know. But again, if you look at the Beatles touring schedule in those days, they were playing constantly. If you look at any one of those, like I've got a T-shirt, Beatles U.S. tour, and the itinerary is like merciless, not one day off. And so and when they weren't on the road, they were in the studio.
Right.
So they were super tight all the time, and they could read each other. You know what I mean? So there's that element of it too, like just a you know, a tight rhythm section, knowing where things go, and you know, playing for, you know, for people who are dancing most of the time, and just letting some creativity, you know, sort of like seep in through the cracks, here and there. You know what I mean? It was later on when the bass would go on last, when
Right.
they would like overdub the bass last. In
Hmm.
fact, Another Day was done like that. Denny told me that he says I didn't hear him play bass once
Yep.
when we were working on Ram. He played guitar, or piano, or sang, and he put the bass. He says I didn't hear the bass lines on Ram until I got my copy of the record.
In
You
a
know?
way, it's like a lot of session musicians never hear the finished product until it's out there, how it sounds.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Yeah.
well, depending on the situation. I mean, if everything's being cut live, that's one thing. But
Yeah.
I do know that, you know, you hear stories about the session scene in New York. Marcus Miller told a story about being online at the Union, Local 802. Back in the days when you had to go to the Local 802 office on 48th Street to pick up your checks,
Hmm.
and Marcus was like the young guy in town, and this guy was online in front of him. I forget his name, but he's one of these bass players that like you don't recognize his name, but he's on everything. The guy
Okay.
works like constantly, and he's like, oh, you're Marcus Miller, you're the new kid. He's like, oh yeah, you're Charles so and so. I forget the guy's name, I'm blanking on him, I apologize. But this guy was known as like the workingest bass player in the land. Jingles, record dates, you name it, everything. And
Hmm.
he gets to the window, and the woman at the window goes, oh, good morning, Mr. so and so. You know, how many of your checks do you want, kind of thing. And the guy's like, oh, just give me 4 inches. And she takes out a stack of checks, because it was like
Wow.
every session had it. You know, you got like another check for like whatever it was, $80, whatever union scale was in the 70s, whatever.
Uh-huh.
And she hands him like a stack of checks, like 4 inches high, like that. And he kind of like shows to Marcus like, yep, it's, you know, that's me. And so all that to say that like session players, you know, the way it was in those days, you get a chart, you read it down once. Sometimes you don't even know who the artist is, depending on how things were done. Sometimes you have a producer that's like going to get the tracks in advance and put the singer's voice on later.
Hmm.
Or sometimes you just clock in and you recognize a few of the guys in the room and a few strangers, and you get the chart, you done, okay, thank you, you know. And so when you meet some of these guys years later, oh, that bass line that you played on such and such, and they go, what? I don't remember doing that session.
Uh-huh.
Or what can you tell us about playing on such and such? And they were like, I don't know, I showed up one day, we read down the chart, and that was it. Asia by Steely Dan. Steve Gadd's drum track on that famously was cut in one take. I think they might have done a second afterward as a safety, but he like read the chart, and Steve Gadd is another one who can just absorb the music and everything that it needs to be just by glancing at the okay, good, and then boom, play something that's absolutely perfect. And I
Wow.
just heard a story about that recently, where I guess 2 days later, Gadd walks into the control room to say hi to the engineer. And the engineer goes, hey man, check this out. And he plays, I guess they'd done some overdubs and sweetening on the track, Asia.
Hmm.
And they play it for Gadd, and he's listening in the back. He says, that sounds great. Who's the drummer on that? And I'm like, he's like, Steve, that's you, 2 days ago. Like, oh, I sound great. You know, that just because that's what it was like, and that was the turnover rate in those days.
I wish that every session musician kept a diary and
Some
wrote down
guys
their
did.
thoughts.
I think there are some guys who did. Milt Hinton was known for taking photos and stuff. But yeah, it's a shame that like there was some of the. I mean, pop music especially was considered sort of disposable at the time.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I mean, the famous story about Louis Armstrong and his group doing "Hello Dolly." Just like in between gigs, they like ran upstairs to a studio somewhere to cut a few tracks, and "Hello Dolly" was like one of 4 or 5 tracks that they cut that day.
Hmm.
They did it in 1 or 2 takes, forgot about it, went back out on the road, and like all of a sudden he's got this like huge hit record that they barely even remember doing. You know, sorry about the dog.
That's
But
okay.
anyway, Um, what else do you want to know before I
Um,
stop me
uh,
before I sub reference again?
just a few things. I know Paul has cited James Jamerson many times as an influence, or sometimes he couldn't remember his name, the Motown guy, he'd call him. Can you hear that influence in Paul's work?
Jamerson's influence.
Yeah, especially.
Um, yeah, I think so. Um, I mean, I'd have to go back and study it. Maybe somebody else has already,
Hmm.
and look at specific bass lines and go, oh, that's from Bernadette. Oh, that's the line from My Girl or whatever. But
Right.
I think in general, you're talking about an approach and a mindset and a sensibility, um, whether or not that can always be articulated. But I think there's a certain level of creativity. I know he's cited Brian Wilson as well
Hmm.
from Pet Sounds, and that's Carol Kay. Um, but I think the freedom and the permission to step out of just playing the root of the chord on a downbeat,
Hmm.
um, and to get a little bit more creative, get a little bit more melodic, because again, and I can't stress this enough, as creative as McCartney ever gets on the bass, as melodic and sort of over the top as he gets, he always supports the groove.
Hmm.
He always does his job as a bass player. This is the thing that's brilliant about him. It's not just about playing a lot of notes or playing a clever counter melody. It's making it fit. You're still in the rhythm section.
Right.
You know what I mean? Um, you still have to provide a foundation to the music. You still have to do that job, and he's never forgotten that. That's why, as busy as he ever got, it still sounds great because it's still doing the job. And I think Jamerson is an exemplar of that. Somebody who could play a lot of notes. Am I in tune? Yeah, okay.
Hmm.
Bernadette,
Okay.
right? He gets that, all those anticipated sixteenths,
Yeah.
right? He puts that in a space where it belongs,
Right.
and it doesn't distract you from the groove. It adds a little bit of extra thing. You know where I hear Jamerson's bass playing influence? Stevie Wonder.
Hmm.
Stevie Wonder's bass lines, especially his early, Music of My Mind, Talking Book, a lot of the keyboard bass, a lot of the synth bass that Stevie would do.
Hmm.
Definite Jamerson influence there, which makes sense because Stevie came up in that rhythm section.
Right.
In fact, there's a great piece of audio um, in a book called "Standing in the Shadows of Motown" that came out in the '80s
Hmm.
about James Jamerson. And it was like transcriptions of a bunch of Jamerson bass lines and famous bassists recreating them, and then some interviews. It came with two tapes, cassette tapes with interviews.
Hmm.
And there's an audio clip of Stevie speaking at Jamerson's funeral. And Stevie says that Jamerson showed me what a bass looks like. Right? So Stevie's conception of how a bass is supposed to sound
Yeah.
and feel comes from Jamerson. So a track like Too High from Intervisions. Ah. There's a way to make this work without
Hmm.
being obtrusive. You know
Right.
what I mean? That's a subtle, again, a very subtle kind of dance that you're doing between, you know, putting down something that's solid with a groove, but and
Right.
leave it alone, let that hang for the rest of the thing because there's something else going on. Just maintaining an awareness of the arrangement. I think Paul got that from Jamerson more than any sort of specific phrases. I'm sure he copped, a lick here and there.
Hmm.
You know, there's only so many variations on root, third, fifth, octave that you can do. But I think it's more about like an approach and a sensibility to being creative in that chair. You know,
Yeah.
I hope that
Yeah.
answers your question.
Yeah. I mean, you've explained everything so well, and you were just saying that it's a lot has to do with, the foundation of the song, not just coming up with great melodies. But there has to have been times when you've heard another bass player since Paul where you'll say, "Wow, I can hear Paul in that," or I can hear an influence in some way.
I
So,
used to yeah I used to feel that way about there were certain guys that I felt were carrying on the tradition
hmm,
of McCartney's melodicism, and then I was like, well, that's not, then I started to look into it. Mike Mazzaros from the Smithereens. Um, there's a track called "I Don't Want to Lose You" from the first Smithereens album, especially for you. Right? And I thought, like, well, surely Massaros grew up listening to McCartney.
hmm,
And then I dug into his background a little bit more, and he's coming out of punk. He was a Stranglers fan.
huh,
You know what I
okay,
mean? But again, I think that spirit of melodic, Still I want you. Excuse me. Still I want you. Just that sort of awareness of like keeping the groove going, but then like when there's a space, you throw in a little something. I think McCartney was the first guy to do that in rock and roll.
hmm,
I could be wrong about this, but I think the first guy to play rock and roll on the bass guitar, to do something other than just like playing the root of the chord on the downbeat. The first guy to kind of step out, you know. I think he's the blueprint for that, of keeping the groove going, keeping it chugging along, but when there's a space, throw in a little something,
hmm,
to keep it interesting. And if you can, and if that becomes a secondary sort of hook to the song that people remember,
yeah,
even better. There's a couple of guys that I think of in that regard. Bruce Thomas
hmm,
from Elvis Costello and the Attractions. Um, Lip service is all you ever get from. I'm really sloppy this morning. I
hmm,
apologize. Lip
it's fine.
service is all you ever get from me.
Hmm,
Things like that, straight out of the McCartney playbook. In fact, Bruce Thomas, I remember there was a Guitar Player magazine interview with him in the 80s, and he talks about working on Rockestra with McCartney on Back to the
hmm,
Egg.
right,
And he says that, he at one point, him and McCartney are hanging out, and he says, I got to tell you, I've stolen so many bass lines of yours over the years. And McCartney picks up his bass and says, well, I've nicked a few things from you as well. And he starts playing the bass line, I Don't Want to Go to Chelsea. Elvis Costello and the Attractions. What is it? You know,
uh-huh,
something like that. Stuff like that. I just think there's a spirit of improvisation that he introduced to the instrument in rock and roll. So, again, we can debate whether or not a certain bass line comes straight from McCartney, or whether they were, whether or not they geeked out on him the way I have. I mean, he's definitely like the North Star for me, along with a bunch of other people, but he was definitely the cat. I mean, like when I started playing bass, it was basically learning his parts.
right.
And that thing of like, be supportive, do your job, but every once in a while throw in a little extra thing, and if the bass line stands as a part on its own, then that's the the ideal goal there.
Yeah, it's a funny thing. You can be inspired by a piece of music and create something that may be very different from what you're hearing.
For sure.
It's all the process of how your brain works, and it's a very complicated thing.
Right, and I think it's also important to utilize this stuff for your own creativity. You know, I
Mm,
say this in the clinic, you know, um, about, you know, yeah, he's using a Rickenbacker and he's using flat wounds, and then, you know, he's got this cable and this amp and this mic. Da 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 da. I said, you can replicate all that stuff and play the part from the record note for note. There's only one thing that you're not going to be able to get your hands on, and that is Paul McCartney's brain
mm-hmm.
at age 25, 26, 27, responding to what's going on around him. And that's not just the drums and the guitars, it's also where he was living, who he was with. You know, if he's not living in England in the 60s, right? Reading English newspapers, watching English television, you know. So yeah, learn what these guys did, but then take that spirit of improvisation, take that spirit of creativity, and apply it to where you are in the present day.
Right.
You know, that's where the, you know, that's where the magic is, as far as I'm concerned. You know what I mean? So you know, tracing these guys' influence, it's like, oh yeah, that sounds like a McCartney kind of thing. I just think once his approach kind of got into the bloodstream, so to
Mm-hmm.
speak, of music, you know, if you're the bass player in a rock band, you're probably influenced by him, whether you realize it or not.
Right.
You know, whether you want to
And
admit it or not.
you could be influenced by another bass player who was influenced by him. So
Exactly,
it's
exactly.
osmosis.
The famous story, I think it was Lee Sklar.
Okay.
Maybe it was Lee Sklar. Somebody was talking about meeting. Oh God, it's like you remember the point of the story, but you don't remember the names.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say it was Lee Sklar talking to Hal Blaine. I think
Okay.
it was a younger, somebody from the Wrecking Crew talking to like a younger guy,
Hmm.
and the Wrecking Crew guy rattling off the list of like every record that they had done in the 60s. And the younger guy saying like, holy crap, I just found out that like my 5 favorite bands growing up were the same people.
That's right. It was all the
You
Wrecking
know?
Crew on so many records.
Exactly.
You
Yeah.
know, I was just talking about that with one of my guests that Hal Blaine was on everything.
Yeah, yeah. Oh yeah.
So much.
Yep. Lee Sklar too. Maybe
Yeah.
that's why his name came up.
All right. Well, John, this has been great. This
Oh,
channel
dude.
is not just my channel, it's your channel. You can come on whenever you want.
Oh,
I
thank
love
you.
talking bass with you. Tell
Same
me
here.
everything going on with you, especially when this pandemic's over and
Yes.
hopefully we'll get to some sense of normalcy again. And anytime you want to come on, talk about gigs you have coming up, let me know.
Sure. Sure.
As long as I
When
keep
that's yep.
learning bass
When
from you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, you know, I could go and go. We'll definitely have to do it another time soon. So,
Yeah.
thank you for having me on and for letting me geek out. It's really important that we stay connected this way.
Yeah.
You know,
And
and yeah.
for anyone interested, I'm going to put links up to the other shows that John was on things we said today, and from my website, and any information you want to post, I'll put in the description box here for the video, for anything at all, for people to get in contact with you. So thank you so much for joining us,
You
John.
got it, my friend. Great to see
And
you.
yeah, to everybody, please subscribe to this channel if you haven't done so already, and also to the other podcast shows that I'm a part of, Things We Said Today, and Talk More Talk, a solo Beatles videocast. Got to have you on those shows.
I was
Well,
just gonna say, yeah.
Talk More Talk is next.
You got it.
Thanks so much,
You got it, my
and
friend.
thanks to all of you for watching. We'll do this again real soon. Take care.
Bye.